Bonjour tout le monde. Ce colloque aura lieu en anglais. Vous avez donc droit à une phrase en français au tout début pour vous dire merci d'être là. On est très heureux d'avoir réussi à faire cette journée d'études parce que ce n'est pas un colloque justement, c'est un lieu où on va travailler sur une thématique très importante sur plusieurs titres et avec un argumentaire tout à fait intéressant, c'est-à-dire on va chercher les traces et on va faire une espèce de tracologie à l'envers. Je fais un family joke, mais Chavdar Marinov travaille sur les traces, les peuples traces. Donc voilà. Je suis très contente de vous accueillir ici de la part de la section moderne et contemporaine de l'École française d'Athènes. Et je vais demander à Cathy Morgan, avec qui on co-organise ces événements qui entrent dans un ensemble qui s'appelle Balkan Futures, mais qui s'appelle aussi History and Anthropology. Et c'est notre façon de travailler avec la BSA depuis 3 ou 4 ans maintenant. Et on est très heureux que cette collaboration avance à petits pas, mais de manière très très sûre, qui va amener des résultats, on espère, très vite sur le plan de l'écrit et ailleurs. Voilà, Cathy.
Thank you very much, Maria, and thank you very much to the Balkans for hosting today's event and to Chavdar for doing practical organisation, which we greatly appreciate. This is a very positive and very good collaboration over a long period. We now have a 3-year programme, of which this is the first year, called Balkan Futures, with a large body of funding from the British Academy. The core of it is history and international relations, but historians and international relations people must continuously be reminded of the importance of history and anthropology. I've just come back from Act 1 in Ankara, where we were looking at Turkish features and engagement in the Balkans, and had to sit through a very entertaining discussion with international relations people trying to quantify soft power in terms of culture. Today we'll explain why it's important and how we can approach it in a different way. I think it's a lovely programme. I'm greatly looking forward to today, and thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Cathy. And Alexandre Parnot will welcome everybody because he has too much.
Avec plaisir, vous accueille pour ce colloque et cette rencontre. Comme le disait Catherine Morgan, c'est pour nous d'abord une collaboration avec l'école anglaise, et une des bonnes collaborations que nous avons dans un domaine qui est important pour nous, dans la section moderne et contemporaine. Donc on est très heureux que ce travail et cette collaboration continuent année après année. On est heureux aussi d'accueillir les intervenants de cette session de l'année 2013 pour explorer la construction des identités et l'actualité des Balkans dans une perspective qui intéresse pas seulement la section moderne et contemporaine, mais en fait tous les spécialistes qui travaillent dans cette région, puisque c'est l'utilisation du passé pour construire le présent. Et donc on est au cœur d'un certain nombre de problématiques qui intéressent aussi les archéologues et les historiens d'art de l'Antiquité. Donc c'est un des bons exemples d'interaction entre nos deux sections antiques et contemporaines. Et donc je remercie Chavdar Marinov et Maria Kourgli de porter ce programme en collaboration avec nos collègues de l'école anglaise. Donc bienvenue à tous et bon travail pour la journée d'aujourd'hui jusqu'à ce soir.
Merci Alexandre. Donc je donne la parole à Chavdar. Tu vas un petit peu introduire la session et on va travailler.
Donc je vais le faire en anglais plutôt.
Oui, tout à fait.
Well,
I don't know if you need that or not, but maybe yes.
Yes, si on veut que ce soit enregistré, oui.
Yes. So, here you go. Oh, yes.
So I would like to welcome everybody as well. And to say just a few words about, well, even if the program of cooperation was already introduced by Professor Kurukli and Professor Morgan. So this is basically a cooperation that has lasted for several years between the two schools. And well, last year we had the first workshop, common workshop, joint workshop on Balkans. The topic was actually quite broad, quite large. The construction of the Balkan identity and the concept of Balkans in the both scholarly field and in the field of international politics. So this year we decided to focus our workshop on the concept of heritage and on the policies of heritage, which is of course still a topic of which is topic of polemics and of political involvement in the region. And why heritage and what we mean by politics of heritage? Actually, there is a notion of literature, of course, on the politics of heritage, focusing on the interpretation first of the heritage, which is a kind of construction already, because, as you can, of course, imagine, it is through the interpretation that what is considered to be monument is selected. And after that, we have, of course, the policies of restoration and patrimonialization of the heritage, which also, in a way, are supposed to, in most of the cases, to give it back its authentic shape. But of course, it is in a way also manipulation for what of the remnants of the past. And on the third side, we have also the touristic usage of heritage and the way it is presented to a broader public. So the participants in this workshop will cover this range of questions, these aspects of the politics of heritage. I would like also to present the discussants that are going to be also, in a way, chairpersons of the two sessions. The chairperson and the discussant of the first session is Leonidas Emberikos, historian and a great specialist of the region of Greece and the Balkans. He is also teaching at the University of Political Sciences, Pandio. He's going to help us to during the first session. The afternoon session will be led by Athina Skoulariki, who is currently a sociologist of media, and currently, unfortunately, she's she has a position at the University of Crete, but because of the current economic crisis, she had to change in the meantime her position, and now she's at the mission, working at the mission of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe in Skopje. She's also a specialist in especially the way the Macedonian question is used, has been used during the last decades. So I give the floor to Leonidas Emberikos, who is going to give us a short presentation of the participants in the first session, including myself. Thank you, Leonidas.
You're welcome.
And thank you for coming.
You're welcome. I'm glad to be here. Tijana Rakic will be our first speaker. She's a lecturer The Edinburgh Napier University, if it's right. Her research interests and publications lie in the areas of heritage, tourism and national identity, ethnography, visual culture, the relationships between travel, tourism and art, and history of tourism in Greece, and the Balkans. Some of the academic research projects she has been involved with include a study surrounding the future of UNESCO's World Heritage List, a study about tourism impacts in the island of Crete, a study about the history of tourism in the Athenian Acropolis, and her doctoral research explored the relationships between World Heritage, tourism and national identity at the Acropolis. She has published 2 edited books, An Introduction to Visual Research Methods in Tourism, in London, Routledge, 2011, and Narratives of Travel and Tourism, Farnham, Ashgate, 2012. And I'm very glad to introduce her. Please.
Thank you. So my talk, given the topic also of the session, will revolve around the relationships of World Heritage Tourism and national identity, a theme that has been the major focus of my PhD, which I had completed in 2008. And I'll try to explore the tensions between the national and the universal in this context. If we just look at the structure of my talk, I'll just give a brief overview of World Heritage Tourism and national identity, then I'll move on to talk about the study context of my PhD. Then I'll just very briefly, given the time strictures of the talk about the historical emergence of the Acropolis as a symbol of Greekness, a World Heritage Site and a tourist attraction. And then I'll move on to the practical parts of my PhD, or primary research that I did, where I analyzed the representations of the Acropolis in postcards, promotional materials and guidebooks, before I take you to the Acropolis and talk a little bit about the visitors at the Acropolis. So the World Heritage concept, as many of you will know, was introduced by UNESCO in 1972, with the World Heritage Convention obliging state parties, signatories to the convention, to identify, protect and preserve heritage of outstanding universal value. And it was the state parties, or the countries who were signatories to the conventions, who were the ones to choose heritage sites to be included on the World Heritage List. What I found most interesting in the concept of World Heritage is that the main concept, the idea of World Heritage, was based on the notions of universality. World Heritage sites, once listed on the World Heritage List, were expected to be perceived as symbols of common identity of humankind. And this is something that I very much liked in the core concept of World Heritage. But what I didn't understand is how can heritage sites, which are very much seen as symbols of national identities, all of a sudden be perceived as belonging and represented to the world, given this simultaneous importance of these places to local national identity. And what I had also been very interested in is the way in which World Heritage and the listing of national heritage sites on the World Heritage List was also an opportunity for a portrayal of particular aspects of national identities, and in this sense World Heritage was also had a role to play in the contemporary nation-building projects. In relation to tourism, of course, many of these places were already popular tourist attractions before they were nominated on the list, and some places became tourist attractions because they were listed on the World Heritage List, because they were given exposure to the outside world. In the context of the Acropolis, why choosing the Acropolis to study the relationships between World Heritage Tourism and national identity? I thought that it was a very interesting case because the Acropolis was seen by UNESCO as a symbol of the World Heritage idea. So it represented the core of their concept of universality and site which belonged and represented the world. It was also seen in contemporary times as the embodiment of Greekness, and at the same time it was the most visited heritage site in Greece. So with these things in mind, I embarked on an interdisciplinary doctoral research, thematically very much rooted in cultural geography and methodologically in visual anthropology. So I looked at the World Heritage Tourism and national identity. I looked at the historical emergence of the Acropolis as a symbol of Greekness, a World Heritage Site and a tourist attraction, mainly through literature review. And then I moved on to study the importance of World Heritage and tourism in the construction and consumption of particular kinds of meanings, those of Greekness of the Acropolis and those of the universality its World Heritage title aimed to convey. So I did semiotic analysis of postcards, guidebooks and promotional materials, looked at the representation of Acropolis in these. And I also conducted a visual ethnographic fieldwork, which lasted for a year, and I spent this time studying how the visitors to the Acropolis, both local and international, experience and perceive the site, as well as what were the meanings that this place during their visit had for them. So if we look at the Acropolis as a symbol of Greekness, as many of you will know, the Acropolis was not throughout time always a symbol of contemporary Greekness. What we have seen, for example, in the Middle Ages is that the glories of ancient Greece had long been forgotten. In the 15th and 16th century, ancient Greece and its written heritage was rediscovered with the rise of humanities and classical scholarship. But at that time, there was still very little interest in physical remains of ancient Greece. It was in the 17th century where the physical remains became a focus of early travelers. They start visiting these places. We also see a rise of antiquity collectors, and very interestingly we see scholarship which is combined with travelogues which are taken back to the places where these travelers came from. The 18th century, of course, sees the stirrings of a national movement which is influenced by Philhellenism, aiming towards liberation from the Ottoman Empire. The 19th century sees the Greek nation-state being created, and the Acropolis is one of the main reasons why Athens is selected as the capital. And it's at the same time that the Acropolis was also organized as an archaeological site, with the main focus being its classical past, rather than any other past of the Acropolis. And the Acropolis very much at that time becomes a symbolic capital of the new nation. Today, all the contemporary Greekness is not rooted solely in classical heritage. Acropolis is seen as the embodiment of all Greekness. And if we look at the history of tourism at the Acropolis, a very brief mention just to give you an overview of how it developed through time. In 17th century, what we saw was the early travelers. They were visiting classical remains. The Acropolis was very much perceived as an ancient castle, most eminent in Athens, which also had the finest mosque in the world at that time. And it was in this period that we see a first accurate visual representation of the Acropolis. By then, it's only written texts. In the 18th century, there is the ever-growing interest in classical remains. The Acropolis becomes a must on the Grand Tour. Travelers start collecting Greek antiquities, start to write their names on marbles, and there is the early commentary here on the importance of the Acropolis for the local identity, for the local population. In the 19th century, we see the development of early guidebooks, which are based on travelers' tales. Lord Elgin takes the marbles to Britain. Travelers start conveying a more romantic perceptions of the nation's bygone glory. And there are also commentaries, thank you, there are also commentaries of the disappointment with the ethnographic presence or disappointment of the local population as not resembling as much as the travelers wanted, at least, with the ancient Greeks. And it's also this period where we see the beginning of postcards through the emergence of photography. In 20th century, this is the time when the Acropolis becomes a very popular, worldwide known tourist attraction. Early accounts contain references to Parthenon or Elgin marbles being stolen from Greece, so we have here a very strong narrative of the Parthenon and the Acropolis as a whole belonging to Greece, and a narrative that Elgin took parts of it which didn't belong to him. It's the time also when the Acropolis was nominated and inscribed on the World Heritage List in '87. And in the late 20th century, we see more than 1 million visitors annually visiting the Acropolis. In the 21st century, it's a globally renowned tourist attraction. It is very much perceived, as far as I could tell from my studies, through the prism of its classical past and as a key symbol of Greekness. And the Acropolis is almost on every tourist's to-do list when they come to Greece or Athens. So moving on to the analysis, I looked at postcards. I managed to collect 141 postcards starting from 1886, so late 19th century, up until 2007. And in these postcards, I saw gradual changes through time and the emergence of the Acropolis as embodiment of Greekness, which was both evident in these postcards, but also reinforced because postcards were also circulating around the world. In this way, reinforcing these meanings of the Acropolis. So in the first period, we see postcards of Athens, and it's very much postcards of the city, with the Acropolis being one of its jewels or one of its very important places, and the Acropolis is in the background. We also see, sorry, the images are not very good. We also see the neoclassical building style in Athens. We see trams, we see the modernization of the city, which is becoming, wanting to be an important European capital, and it's very much presenting itself as such. In the next period in which I had the postcards from 1914 to 1939, the Acropolis is already more recognizable. It becomes the most important place and the most glorious place in Athens. It represents Athens. But at the same time, the Acropolis is represented as being visited only by the privileged classes or visitors from abroad, whereas the locals are represented as peasants in the picturesque landscape. In the 1980s, the Acropolis is already very widely known visually throughout the world, and we see the Acropolis being the main representation of Athens, and also represented as a great place to visit for many travelers, because on the right-hand side we see many tourists in front of the Acropolis. And in the final period, the Acropolis becomes the symbol, the flag of Greece. It becomes the main representation for the country. It's what the country as a whole is known for. We see, for example, on the left-hand side, the image of the Acropolis superimposed on the Greek flag, and on the right-hand side we see a postcard of all of Greece where the Acropolis takes the central stage. And although the Acropolis is, we see the emergence of the Acropolis as a symbol of Greekness, as an important monument for Greek and local national identity, we don't see any references to the universality or the World Heritage concept intended to convey, and the only reference to any international element is its importance as a tourist attraction. If we move on to the Greek National Tourism Organization's promotional campaign, there I collected 5 years of promotional material, and there the tensions between this universal and national belonging and meanings of the Acropolis are also evident. For example, in a guidebook, we are told that the Acropolis is the symbol of Athens, the sacred rock linking the fabulous ancient civilization with the modern city. The monuments on the sacred rock date back to the prehistoric era and antiquity. The grandeur and the beauty of the sacred rock attract both Greek and foreign visitors. Here we are told essentially that the Acropolis is a symbol of Athens and by extension a symbol of Greece, symbolizing Athenian and by extension the Greek identity. We have no reference once again to any sense of universality or universal belonging of the Acropolis. And another example I chose for today is from a poster where the Acropolis is depicted under the words architecture, and the text says, "Architecture, word of Greek origin, it connects science and art. Greece owns more shining architectural points of glance than any other European country. Simply come and discover this." Here, once again, we have an explicit reference that the Acropolis is owned by Greece and thus not the world, despite the fact that we also have reference to other European countries and so on. And what we have seen in what I have seen in promotional materials of the Greek National Tourism Organization for this period is that despite its World Heritage status, the universal value and significance is represented primarily, the Acropolis is represented primarily as a symbol of Greek national identity, and there is little reference to universality. There is no explicit mention of its World Heritage status nowhere in these materials, despite the fact that some countries such as Spain have extensively used the status of World Heritage in their promotional campaigns. And moving on to guidebooks, I had collected 10 guidebooks from about the Acropolis, Athens and Greece from 2006. In those, again, there are tensions between national and universal ownership and belonging. The place meanings of the Acropolis, once again, are more about its sense of Greekness than about its sense of universality. The global significance of the Acropolis is mentioned, especially in the context of tourism, because it has the status of a very popular tourist attraction, but the Acropolis is represented very much as being sacred to the Greeks and only an attraction to the tourist. What I was surprised to find is a mention of World Heritage status in 2 of these guidebooks, so I looked into that. Lonely Planet, for example, briefly mentioned the World Heritage status and the universal importance of the site. At the same time, though, it has a very strong narrative of national belonging. For example, on page 10, there is an image of the Parthenon on the right-hand corner there, and the caption underneath says, "The bits of the Parthenon Lord Elgin couldn't fit in his suitcase." And then we also have a text about the new Acropolis Museum, which has a massive gallery intended for Parthenon marbles built in the hope that international pressure would shame the British Museum into returning them. Once again, a very strong narrative of national belonging and the tensions surrounding the British marbles, the Elgin marbles that are in Britain reinforced here. Another guidebook, Heritage Walks in Athens, had once again a strong emphasis on Greek ownership and belonging of all heritage sites in Athens. And despite the universal dimension, which is mentioned in the text below, primarily ownership and belonging again reinforces being Greek. So for example, on page 5 in the introduction of this guidebook, what we are told is that our, meaning Greek, monuments are continuous guardians of memory. It is not only the past of Greece, but the roots of the Western world. It is here that we see the reference to universal dimension in the roots of the Western world. And the influence of the East, once again, an international dimension that can be found in our museums. But at the same time, we are told that the monuments are ours, meaning Greek. So, trying to take you at least for a 2-minute walk around the Acropolis. I'll show you a short video visitors at the Acropolis, and I tried to create the video to show the choreography of movements in the contemporary visit. So here it goes. I hope everything is working. Mainly perceived the Acropolis as being a very Greek place with its own universal or international dimension, being the actual visitors and its global fame. Diana, for example, from the US, told me that she felt, being at the site, that the Acropolis was definitely very Greek, just because you associate the Acropolis with Greece and you see so many pictures. Even in American school, she says, you learn about the ancient Greeks and that's what you see the pictures of. So it definitely felt very Greek to her, but also international, because there were so many visitors from all over the world that were there. She heard very many languages and got the feel that this was the place that people all over the world knew about and came to see. And many of the locals whom I spoke to at the Acropolis also felt that the Acropolis was very much a Greek place, a Greek site. There was a sense of Greekness attached to it. But at the same time, their visit was felt akin to a pilgrimage. Many perceived the visit to the Acropolis as returning to their roots. And this was a source of great national pride. Maria, for example, from Athens, said that she was proud, especially when she could compare that it was one of the characteristic Greek things of, I'll just read her quote, it was one of the characteristic Greek things of our country which represents it. Like other countries, like the Statue of Liberty, which is characteristic for America, or the Eiffel Tower, and that the Acropolis goes even further back in time, and that maybe comparatively its value is bigger. It is nice, she said, sometimes to return to your roots, so you don't forget where you started from. The Acropolis, makes us feel what we are. And just to conclude, what I found from my study and its many different elements is that tourism at the Acropolis had and still has a role to play in the contemporary Greek nation-building project. Despite its World Heritage status, both producers of tourist materials that I analyzed and the visitors to the site still perceive the Acropolis as being more about the sense of Greekness than its sense of universality, which its World Heritage status intended to convey. These findings raise very important questions about the universal validity of the actual idea of World Heritage, and have also made it possible to perceive World Heritage as a project which failed to create a world category of heritage. At least for the Acropolis, the place which I studied, and which is a symbol for the World Heritage idea, World Heritage can perhaps be more appropriately understood as a synonym for contested heritage, torn between its global fame and a sense of local ownership and belonging. Thank you. I tried to present the summary of the whole PhD because this was the thread of the main theme of the PhD, but there are many publications that came out from there in different, so if you're interested in any aspect of this presentation, you can just drop me an email and I'll send you the publications. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. It was extremely interesting.
Thank you.
So maybe I'm going to take your place now.
Yes.
Thank you.
Can you pass?
Yeah, of course. Sorry.
So, yeah. This. So I introduce you to Chavdar Marinov. He received his PhD in History and Civilizations from the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris in 2006. Since 2010, he's a fellow of the French School at Athens. Chavdar Marinov is the author of The Macedonian Question from 1944 to nowadays, Communism and Nationalism in the Balkans, Partie 2010, which was based on his doctoral thesis, which I know, and it's the most complete work on the controversy on the symbols between the Republican Macedonia and Bulgaria, on the two parallel approaches or approaches on the history of the revolt and the history of the same place. His research interests are in the fields of nation-building processes in the Balkans, politics of language and politics of cultural heritage in the Balkans, architecture and nationalism, political usages of antiquity in the Balkans. He is currently working on the ideological aspects on the Thracian studies in Romania, Bulgaria and Greece. Please, Chavdar, continue.
Thank you, Leonidas. So for this conference, I chose to present a case study that actually shows the process of positive evaluation of Byzantine and Ottoman heritage in Bulgaria, a positive evaluation through its interpretation as a national heritage. So I will discuss here the symbolic appropriation of certain types of monuments that do not have necessarily national belonging, if they have one at all. And I'm interested here in the question how this belonging is actually constructed and in the impact of this construction over the heritage itself. The case I deal with is the one of the town of Melnik, known in Greek as Meleniko. It is a very small town in what is today southwestern Bulgaria, actually in the Bulgarian part of the historical region of geographic Macedonia, known this particular region as Pirin Macedonia. It is, well, you see it on the map, this is the southwestern corner of Bulgaria, and Melnik is a little bit to the southeast of Sandansky, of the town of Sandansky. It is indeed very small. The inhabitants of Melnik are officially about 250, but in reality they are much less. Thus, Melnik is actually smaller than the average population of a village in Bulgaria and much smaller than a big part of the villages in that country. So why Melnik, finally? Certainly its dimensions make it a relatively easy case to study. However, the main reason of my choice is not only that. On the one hand, despite its present shape, Melnik used to be an important place in the Byzantine and Ottoman and in the Ottoman past. Second, it is also an important reference in the present definitions of Bulgarian architectural and urban heritage. And here comes the main reason of my choice. Melnik actually presents a striking case of what could be qualified as invention of heritage through an interpretation of heritage in a national sense. In the case of Melnik, one can analyze this invention process on three levels. First, the construction of a selective historical narrative about the past. Second, symbolic appropriation of the Byzantine monuments, and three, symbolic appropriation of the monuments from the Ottoman epoch. Concerning the first point, the construction of certain historical narrative through what could be qualified as manipulation of history as well. In Bulgaria, there is a considerable amount of popular literature on Melnik, especially from the socialist period, which presents it as a traditional Bulgarian town with an age-old history. In the popular presentations, one emphasizes the idea that it was a Bulgarian stronghold during the Middle Ages. Here, the main reference is the short-lived statelet of the Bulgarian despot Alexis Slav in the 13th century, which had Melnik as a center. And the same popular narratives connect Melnik especially to the so-called period, the period of the so-called national revival during the late Ottoman period. So this is the time of Bulgarian national rebirth, of the Bulgarian national struggles against the Greek cultural and the Turkish political domination. Certain authors of such presentations explicitly consider that in the 19th century and before its liberation from the Ottoman rule during the Balkan Wars, Melnik was a town of compact Bulgarian population, as they say, and a fortress of a struggle against the so-called fanariots, a term that in the Bulgarian usage covers all kinds of Greek-speaking church and urban elite. On the background of this presentation, it would be interesting to consult the statistics of the local population made in the very beginning of the 20th century, not by somebody else, but by the Bulgarian geographer Vasil Kanchov, who actually discovered in Melnik a population of 4,330 people, and the Bulgarians were not more than 500. In the same time, the town was inhabited by 2,650 Greeks, 950 Turks, as well as by Roma and Vlachs. Kanchov and the other travelers who have visited the town in the 19th century and in the beginning of the 20th underlined that the town had a Greek face and that the Greek language was spoken not only in the street, that is in public spaces as a language of prestige, but also as a vernacular domestic language. Quite naturally, Greek historiographical accounts attest the age-old Hellenic character of Meleniko. It was a traditional seat of metropolitan bishop affiliated with the Patriarchate of Constantinople. In the 18th century, Meleniko was the native town of a rich merchant class with colonies residing in Venice, Vienna, Budapest, and elsewhere. By the same time, the end of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th century, Meleniko was the birthplace of important Greek intellectuals such as Athanasios Polyzoidis. This is his monument in Sidirokastro, in Greek Macedonia, politician, diplomat, founder of the University of Athens in the quality of Minister of Education. As early as in 1813, the local church commune adopted a city charter that you see to the left, precising the functions of the local communal council, Kinonia, which was perhaps the first document of this type in the Ottoman Balkans. A separate Bulgarian commune appeared only by the end of the 19th century, but according to the Bulgarian sources, it consisted of 3 inhabitants of the town and some peasants from the Bulgarian villages nearby. By the same time, the Greek commune had 4 schools, one for boys, another one for girls, an elementary school and a college. There had been a Bulgarian school since the 1880s, but it was attended only by children from the neighboring villages. During the Greek-Bulgarian clashes in Macedonia between 1904 and 1908, known in Greek historiography as the Macedonian struggle, or Makedonikos Agonas, Meleniko did not take part in the national movement of the Bulgarian Macedonian organization, known as the Komitadžis, Komitadžides. The town actually opposed them and supported the partisans of the Greek cause, the Andartes, and in the same period the citizens of Meleniko established Greek patriotic, cultural and charitable organizations such as the Sindesmos Evelpidon Meleniko and the the organization of women Harmonia. Because of all this historical background, Greek authors characterize Meleniko today as the dead guardian of the Macedonian Hellenism, on nekros akritas to Makedoniku Hellenismu. Dead is a word that actually characterizes relatively well the destiny of Meleniko after the Balkan Wars. The town was practically abandoned by its population after its alleged liberation by the Bulgarian army. As a result of the First Balkan War, the Turkish population left the town, but the Greek was still there until the Second War, when it welcomed the Hellenic soldiers as liberators. But the final granting of Meleniko and of its region to Bulgaria resulted into a mass departure of the Greek majority. The other consequence was the considerable destruction of heritage. First, the Muslim neighborhoods were set afire, as it seems by the Bulgarian Macedonian Komitadžis. Second, the Greek neighborhood were pillaged after the departure of the Greek population. The destruction of Melnik was observed by the Bulgarian Macedonian scholar Ljubomir Miletic in 1914. He stated that the population from the neighboring villages, quotation, keeps on collecting from the empty houses whatever it is able to rob. The huge houses of the Greek urban class, known as archondika, were used by the peasants for construction material, and Miletic feared that after his visit, some of the most remarkable buildings were completely destroyed. This process continued in the 1920s, when the Bulgarian authorities settled in Melnik, exchanged population coming from eastern Greek Macedonia. Today, Bulgarian authors writing about the history of Melnik denounce the foreign invaders who allegedly, quotation, were strong enough to destroy many precious monuments in Melnik. They destroyed houses and fortresses, temples and monasteries, end of quotation. But such emotional exclamations hide the fact that the case of Melnik is exactly the opposite. The allegedly age-old Bulgarian town was destroyed namely in Bulgaria by Bulgarians following the departure of its population, whose majority was not Bulgarian. However, by the end of the 1950s, the Bulgarian state institutions launched the patrimonialization of what was left. A number of houses were listed in the Register of National Monuments, and their restoration started in the beginning of the 60s. In 1964, Melnik was proclaimed architectural reservation, and in 1968, it acquired the status of museum town. In order to revive it, special measures were taken by the socialist state for the development of local wine growing and for its touristic promotion. This strategy led to the construction of some disproportionately huge buildings, like this hotel of the state-run touristic company Balkan Tourist, which was inaugurated in 1979. However, the 1970s marked a turn to a more conservative strategy. The projects of the same decade were meant rather to preserve the authenticity of the old town. The restoration works took often the aspect of embellishing what was left. The plans included also the reconstruction of monuments that did not exist anymore, something that finally happened on a small scale. But how can one explain this sudden interest of the state towards a heritage that was previously abandoned and largely destroyed? Here I come to the second point, the symbolic appropriation of Byzantine heritage. As long as the modern history of Melnik was not able to provide the town enough Bulgarian identity, the Bulgarian scholars whose activity determined the policies of patrimonialization turned to the medieval period. This interest is certainly legitimate. On the plateau to the south of the town, one can see ruins of medieval buildings. You see to the left the Basilica of St. Nicholas from the late 12th century. For instance, this is the most, how to say, the best preserved building that you can see on the plateau, so to say. What is more important, what used to be much more important as buildings on this plateau were the monasteries of Saint Mother of God Spiliotissa, named also Saint Zoni, as it used to be a metochion of the Vatopediou monastery on Mount Athos, and the monastery of Saint Charalambios. On the same hill, one can find also the remnants of the fortress attributed to the only Bulgarian ruler of Melnik, the aforementioned Alexislav, from the 13th century. In 1966, Bulgarian archaeologists began excavations at the so-called Slavs fortress, which was even partially reconstructed. The ethnic reading of the medieval history of Melnik is certainly problematic. Ironically, the only documents we have from the reign of Alexislav are written in Greek. According to the historical sources, the despot in question did not recognize the authority of the Bulgarian king and established close contacts with the Latins and the Byzantines. The exclusive focus on Alexislav's domination, a rule of 15 to 18 years at the maximum, actually accounts the much longer Byzantine rule over the town and the multiplicity of the archaeological layers and findings, some of which going back to antiquity, to the late antiquity and to the early Byzantine period, in particular to the reign of Justinian the Great. To complicate the picture, Melnik spent more years even under Serbian rule, between 1350 and 1390, when Macedonia was under Serbian rule. Despite this, Bulgarian Byzantinologists such as Ivan Dujčev stated that the medieval monuments of Melnik, in particular its churches and monasteries, were built by, quotation, local Bulgarian master builders. The complete absence of sources about the nationality of the medieval master builders was not a problem for the Bulgarian specialists, as they also tried to demonstrate that on stylistic level the monuments of Melnik were a part of a separate medieval Bulgarian architectural school and not of the Byzantine architecture. To a large extent, the attempt to show the Bulgarian belonging of medieval Melnik was a reaction to the publication in 1969 of the book of Theodoros Vlachos, History of the Byzantine Town of Melenikon, which was edited in German. Here, a closer look at the thesis promoted by Bulgarian art history is also necessary. In fact, a big challenge to Bulgarian history of art and architecture was launched much earlier by an alumnus of the French school at Athens. In 1916, Gabriel Millet published his book L'école grecque dans l'architecture byzantine, where he argued the existence of a provincial school of Byzantine architecture in the Balkans, which he named Greek school, whose architectural plans, techniques, and stylistic matrix were different from those in Constantinople. In this manner, not only Melnik, but also practically all the medieval architecture in Bulgaria, at least from the 11th century on, fell under the Gabriel Millet's heading Greek school. What was also especially preoccupying is that Millet and a number of other scholars from Western Europe, Russia, and the Balkans did not find at all Bulgarian medieval heritage in the much disputed region of Macedonia, of which Melnik is also a part. Millet, for instance, found only Byzantine and Serbian architectural legacy in Macedonia, despite the effort of the Bulgarian authors to demonstrate the existence of what they called Bulgarian antiques in Macedonia. In response, Bulgarian art historians from the interwar period on, such as Bogdan Filov and Nikola Mavrudinov, attempted to show the Bulgarian nature of the provincial Byzantine architecture, especially in Macedonia. They conceptualized the existence of a distinct Old Bulgarian architecture. Here some technological and stylistic features like the brick decoration, you can see also in all the churches of Athens, and the cloisonné technique that we find also in Melnik, were especially instrumentalized by Bulgarian scholars. Despite the effort to show the Bulgarian belonging of the medieval heritage of Melnik, the alleged stronghold of Alexis Slav, the Bulgarian scholars are even nowadays strangely silent about the fact that most of this heritage does not exist anymore. This is in particular the case of the big spiritual centers of Melnik, the Spiliotissa monastery and the Saint Haralambios monastery. Some years ago, the Bulgarian archaeologists published a huge volume on the monastery of Mother of God Spiliotissa. You see its present shape, which states only that after the Balkan Wars it was abandoned. In fact, the churches of the monastery were extensively studied by another alumnus of the French school at Athens. This was Paul Perdizet, during his mission in Macedonia under the aegis of the school in the very beginning of the 20th century. The result was the important article Melnik et Rosno, published in 1907 in the Review of the French School, Bulletin de Correspondance Hellénique, where Perdizet gave an extremely detailed description not only of the Spiliotissa monastery but also of the one of Saint Haralambios, as well as of a number of other Byzantine monuments, as the Church of Saint Nicholas on the same plateau. Moreover, Perdizet attested the existence of nearly 60 churches, medieval churches in Melnik. Today, there is almost nothing left of this heritage. Yet, buildings such as Spiliotissa monastery were certainly seen not only by Perdizet, but they are still visible on pictures from the beginning of the 20th century. The Bulgarian scholar Ljubomir Miletic has visited it in 1940. This fact actually suggests that all these important Byzantine and post-Byzantine monuments disappeared only within Bulgaria after the so-called liberation of Melnik in the Second Balkan War, a detail which is obviously absent in the works of Bulgarian specialists. Apart from these buildings, the Bulgarian narrative about the medieval Melnik refers to a building situated in the very center of the town. Its masonry, so not on the plateau to the south, where most of the medieval buildings are, but in the town itself. Its masonry is obviously Byzantine, and in fact it is a house that was still inhabited in the beginning of the 20th century. It was called by the locals Tospiti tu Bamburu or Torhondikotu Bamburu, that is the residence of the family of Bamburos, which seems to be a local deformation of the name Flamburas. It is practically the only medieval house which is more or less preserved in Bulgaria. It was noticed by Perdizet and described in detail by the French archaeologist and army general Léon de Bellier in his huge volume L'Habitation Byzantine, 1902. De Bellier considers it to be the only private house known to us from the Byzantine epoch. But it is likely that it used to be not the only one in Melnik. The Bulgarian geographer Kunchov discovered, as he put it, 3 or 4 huge houses of stone preserved from the Middle Ages, all of them owned, according to him, by old Greek families. Being the only one that survived the destructions after the Balkan War and the interwar period, the building was initially denoted by the Bulgarian authors as the Byzantine house. However, in 1965, the biggest authority of the Byzantine studies in Bulgaria, Ivan Duichev, suggested that this designation was too unspecified. Thus, the door was open to all kinds of hypotheses and speculations, and in the 1970s, the Byzantine house changed name for good. From then on, it was named the Boyar House. Without any reference to concrete data, The Bulgarian specialists started declaring that it was the residence of some Bulgarian noblemen, boyar, and some authors suggested that this was, of course, Alexis Slav. This allegation is highly problematic insofar as, according to the archaeological researchers as well, the medieval Melnik was located mostly on the plateau to the south of the present town, and it would be strange to discover the boyar residence in the middle of an unprotected place. A typical example of invention of heritage, the boyar house figured in diverse plans of reconstruction. It was supposed also to host an exhibition about Alexis Slav's rule. Here, the manipulation of dating was also essential. Most of the non-Bulgarian specialists, after de Bellier, have dated the monument to the 14th century, and more concretely to the epoch of the Serbian rule in Macedonia. The Greek architect and archaeologist Nikolaos Moutsopoulos insisted that the building dates back to the 15th century, even to the period after the conquest of Constantinople. Yet the Bulgarian authors regularly insisted that the boyar house was from the 13th century in order to fit in the right chronology. Thus, the existence of any kind of heritage different from Bulgarian was rejected. Yet, the very different definition of what Bulgarian heritage means was extremely large, as the next example shows, namely the appropriation of Ottoman heritage. Unlike the Byzantine monuments that are reduced to ruins, there are a number of vernacular houses from the Ottoman period in Melnik, many of which were restored during the socialist period. Today, they are defined as Bulgarian revival houses. That is, they are closely associated to the development of the Bulgarian national movement in the 19th century, termed in historiography as revival period. Indeed, the vernacular house type that we find in Melnik is more or less the same as those that we can see in other patrimonialized places in the country. Today, this house type is particularly kind of national cultural hallmark of Bulgaria. Initially, this architecture did not attract much scholarly interest. When the archaeologist and art historian Bogdan Filov visited Melnik in 1916, this is how he described the residence of the family Kurdupalos. Quotation: "The house was made in 1758, but it is not very solid and not very interesting as a building." End of quotation. Even in his History of Bulgarian Art under Turkish Domination, published in Germany in 1933, Filov expressed his contempt towards what he qualified as primitive character of the Bulgarian house architecture from the Ottoman epoch. In the beginning of the 20th century, especially in the period before the First World War, the modern Bulgarian architects took their inspiration mostly from the pre-Ottoman period, the one of the medieval Bulgarian kingdoms. They used elements of what they called Byzantine style or Bulgarian Byzantine style in their projects of new buildings in a national style, as witnessed by a series of public buildings in the center of Sofia built before the First World War. Although there were exceptions, in general, the features of the house architecture from the Ottoman epoch were still associated to the same epoch. In many cases, this house type was called Turkish house or Turkish architecture. Yet, since the 1920s, the vernacular houses from the Ottoman period have been definitively imagined as the most characteristic architectural heritage of Bulgaria. The reasons for this choice are certainly many and could not be discussed here in detail. One of the factors is that although scholars such as Filov launched the theory about a particular old Bulgarian architecture different from the Byzantine, the imagination of sufficiently distinct architectural style was not so successful. In the same time, it must be taken into account that in Bulgarian usage the term Byzantine sounds as equivalent to Greek, and that from the outset in the 19th century, Bulgarian national ideology sought to emancipate its putative ethnic community from what was perceived as Greek cultural domination. That is why many architects in the 20s rejected the usage of the Neo-Byzantine elements in the new Bulgarian architecture. The same specialists turned instead to the vernacular architecture from the Ottoman period. They idealized the naive character of the simple master builders from the late Ottoman period. In the 1930s, the architect Todor Zlatev published 2 volumes dedicated to what he called the Bulgarian house. in this effort, the similarity of the vernacular architecture in Bulgaria with the one in other parts of the former Ottoman Empire was progressively downplayed. The architects from the interwar period sought analogies rather with the Italian Renaissance and Renaissance architecture, and even with the European Baroque. Finally, in the 1950s, under communist rule, the architects codified the notion of Bulgarian revival house, result of the fact that most of the preserved houses from the Ottoman period are namely from the period of the so-called national revival. And this was also a search of completely autochthonous architectural development without influences neither from the Ottoman East nor from the European West. In this way, the Bulgarian history of architecture completely discarded the fact that the Bulgarian vernacular houses from the Ottoman period belong to a more or less common Ottoman house type that characterizes a huge zone both in the Balkans and in northwestern Asia Minor. Thus, the fact that members of other nationalities used to build the same houses was completely occulted. Not by random, as early as in 1949, the Greek ethnographer Georgios Megas, born in Messimvria, Neseber at the Bulgarian Black Sea coast, protested against this appropriation with his book I Eliniki Ikia, the Greek house, where he tried to demonstrate the uninterrupted historical continuity of this house type since the ancient Greek peristyle. In the case of Melnik, the codification of Bulgarian revival, in particular house architecture, had particular mission to forge the image of a completely Bulgarian revival Melnik, as the houses there are namely revival houses, supposed to be revival houses. Moreover, in the 1960s, the Bulgarian specialist even discovered a particular Melnik type of house. The description of this house type is vague, as it is in general applicable to the vernacular architecture of the period, with the exception of one distinctive element, the two rows of windows, the upper one being of stained glass and with purely decorative and illuminating function. These are windows impossible to open. As a matter of fact, behind this description, one may recognize a concrete house in Melnik. This is the aforementioned house of the Kurdopoulos family, which is known also as the house of Kordopoulos, although it seems that this form is a result of later association with the extremely widespread Greek family ending Opoulos. In the popular literature, it is even identified as the biggest revival house in Bulgaria. The fact that it was built earlier than the so-called revival, Bulgarian revival in the 1750s, according to most of the chronologies of this period, as well as the fact that it belonged to a Greek family, is comfortably omitted. Nowadays, an information plaque tells the visitors that the owner of the house was a certain Manou Kordopulov, and the form with the Slavic ending of exists also in a number of touristic guides and websites. The nationality of the owner is certainly not the only problem. The house of Kordopulov shows all the selectivity of the Bulgarian architectural theory about the so-called revival house. First, it is visibly similar to a number of vernacular residences in the Balkans, and not only in the Balkans, in particularly with the rich archondika in towns in Greek Macedonia as Siatista, Veria, and Kasturia. And it must be noted that these had predominantly Greek and Vlach-speaking population apart from Turkish, and not or almost not Slav-speaking. In the same kind of archondika with two ranges of windows are to be found in Epirus and Thessaly, nowadays especially in the South Albanian or North Epirot town of Girocastor, Argyro-Castro. Second, the two rows of windows with an upper row of stained glass windows are typical element of the classical and not only classical Ottoman architecture that one can see already in the so-called House of Murad II in Bursa and Çinili Kiosk in Istanbul, both from the 15th century as well as in the Topkapı Palace and in endless series of mosques and public buildings at least until the 19th century. All this context is of course completely absent from the way the heritage of Melnik is presented to wider public, particularly to tourists. Those who visit today the house of Kordopulov even find there, instead of hammam, a sauna. Moreover, in Melnik there are former Muslim houses that are also presented as pieces of Bulgarian revival architecture, like the House of the Bey from 1815, where one can easily distinguish the two wings of the Muslim domestic space, the Selamlık and the Harem. The example of Melnik, formerly known as the Greek town of Meleniko, shows some basic mechanisms of construction of national heritage. We see how the process of patrimonialization entails the symbolic appropriation and nationalization of remnants of past that was not necessarily national, or had in some cases the wrong national belonging. In the case of the Byzantine heritage, we see its reinterpretation based on an extremely selective reading of historical data, as well as on certain stylistic speculations. In the case of Ottoman heritage, it is question of a positive evaluation of a part of it. The house architecture receives much more positive treatment than the buildings associated to the Muslim code, the mosques in particular. This positive treatment is likewise made possible by the abstraction of the local heritage from a much wider context. Finally, it is this construction of authenticity that is presented to the public and thus shapes its own understanding of national heritage. Thank you for the attention and sorry for being so long in my presentation.